Franz, beginnst du?
Nein, die Giuliana.
Ach so.
Sorry, meine Türglocke hat geläutet. Okay, so, ich lese ein paar verschiedene Geschichten. Das heißt, das, was wir machen wird, ist, dass ich lese was und dann liest Franz was. Wir machen das abwechselnd. Und was ich lese, ist von einem Buch auf Englisch, die heißt Jewish Folk Tales in Britain and Ireland. Und was ich habe gedacht, ist, dass ich lese erst den Vorwort, weil man denkt, gibt es sowas? Ja? Okay. Introduction. When I told someone I was writing a book of Jewish folk tales in Britain, they laughed and questioned, is there such a thing? Then I explained what I meant, not only stories grown here, but brought here in the successive waves of immigration since Roman times. Ah, they said, of course. It was clear to me what I wanted to do, but not always clear to those I needed to tell me stories. Stories their elders brought with them and either told as they were or changed around a little to fit the places they found themselves in. I wanted to give a voice to those communities who were disappearing before my eyes. There are far more cities and towns settled by Jews than I have space to include here. Some tales were definitely historically linked to a town or city. Others have, through oral story building, gained a place that wasn't theirs in the first place. But that is true of all immigrants. We change the stories to fit our present and sometimes change our past to fit our future. In this constantly changing flow of ideas of what makes a people, I think it is pertinent to tell the stories of the Jewish people in Britain. I remember friends of my parents who had numbered tattoos on the inside of their arms. I often wondered as a small child, why? As Jews, we are not allowed to tattoo our skin, and it was both the man and the woman. No one talked about it. I knew enough not to ask, but then, not then. Of course, I learned later about the Holocaust, the concentration camps, and the death camps. My siblings and I are second generation Welsh. Our parents were both born in Wales, and though 3 of my grandparents were born in Eastern Europe, the Russian Pale of settlement that included Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, and came in during the 1880s, 1900s wave, my maternal grandmother was also born in Wales to a family that had come to Devonport in the 1840s. 4 generations, British on one side, 4 generations who have not had a suitcase packed by the bed in case they were thrown out again. My own children and grandchildren add to the length of time we have been settled here, and being British is part of our identity. As a young girl, I started to research Jewish communities, learning stories and tales as I went. Through Cheder, I learned more tales from the Tanakh and from the Talmud. I was hooked. This isn't a book of anti-Semitic tales. Goodness knows there are enough of them, especially in areas of Britain where Jews haven't been a presence for more than 800 years. How these stories are held in the folk memory and why are different research questions. It is not a book of tales about the Jews from a non-Jewish perspective. Again, this type proliferates in literary writing. It is, however, a book of Jewish memory, tales, songs, and jokes of Jews by Jews told in Britain and Ireland. Jews can tell the same tales all over Britain and adapt them to their landscape or not. What is important is the story. As the Dubno Magid said, when asked how his stories were always exactly what his listeners needed to hear, let me tell you a story. A young prince was the greatest archer in the kingdom. He won every contest going. He was proud of his achievement. One day he was out riding and happened upon a ramshackle cottage. No wall was the same height as another. The roof was higgledy-piggledy. He would have ridden by it if he hadn't noticed targets painted on the walls of the cottage, and in the center of every target was an arrow, The prince was amazed. Some of the targets would have been difficult for him, let alone an inferior archer. He called out. A young lad came out. The prince asked him if his parents were home. No, answered the lad. Well, asked the prince, did your father shoot these arrows? No, answered the lad. Your mother? No, answered the lad. Don't tell me you did, asked the prince. No, answered the lad. Then who did? Asked the prince, understandably frustrated. The lad disappeared behind the cottage and emerged holding the hand of a little girl of about 4. The prince watched as the little girl took up her wooden bow and arrow and shot at the cottage walls. As soon as her arrow landed, her brother fetched a pot of paint and painted the target around it. The arrow now stood firmly in the center. And that is how my stories are, said the Dubno Magid. I send them out, but you hit the target. I have heard this one brought up to date with a sharpshooter in the Austrian army without the Dubno Magid. Same tale, different landscape, told both times by Jews in Britain. Sometimes I have attributed stories to certain areas without the certainty that these tales were the exact ones told there, reasoning that these types of stories would, on the side of probability rather than possibility, be told there. For example, tailoring stories in the Leeds area. I have put a story told by the people from that community, for example, German, Iranian, or Sephardi, where those communities settled in Britain. If I attribute a story to a country, it is the Jewish population of that country who tell the tale, for example. If I state a tale comes from Germany, it is a tale told by German Jews, not by the population as a whole, and so on. Jewish tales are Jewish tales and are still being told, transmuted, and translated into the idiom of today. For us, it doesn't matter that they were told in Russia, Afghanistan, China, Argentina, or Australia. The Torah, the Bible, and the Talmud, the oral Torah, hold stories that shine as much now as they did for our forebears. We set them where we feel comfortable. I have included some personal stories, and I am grateful to my individual contributors for allowing me to use them. And she goes on to thank various people who have been involved in this. Although I am not expecting this to be, nor should you, an examination of Jewish practice for the uninitiated, I hope the stories stand with the briefest of explanation. Before each section of tales, I have added a succinct history of the Jewish community in the areas Jewish rites within the history or tales where necessary. In the glossary, you will find an explanation of foreign words. She goes on to talk about how she has formed different words from Hebrew and Yiddish. I hope these Jewish stories will lead you to retell them to your children and your children's children. Ledor vador, from generation to generation. So I will read the first story. London. Henry VIII wanted to make his court the best there was anywhere. To do this, he recruited musicians from all over the world. In the 1540s, he established a royal court of musicians, Italian Jewish musicians and instrument makers, who came from Venice with their families. They were allowed in on license from the king, arranged by Thomas Cromwell, who paid their passage. Some had arrived earlier, like Anthony Moises, a sackbut player, who had come in 1526. When Anthony was dying, he chose as his executors not the English wind players he had known for 16 years, but the 4 Italian Jewish viol players he'd only known for 18 months. The musicians settled initially in London. They relied on royal patronage whilst also dealing in trade, having strong links to Antwerp. Whilst some married within the faith, there were many who married out. The most successful families, the Lupos, Comis, and bassanos, established musical dynasties that dominated royal music for more than a century. The Italian Jewish musicians kept away from the other Jews on license, the Portuguese doctors and lawyers. At one point, the Italian Jews lived on one side of the street and the Portuguese Jews on the other in a small village. They didn't mix at all. They held their own services and the families never spoke. The Portuguese Jews looked down on their fellow Jews as ill-educated paupers. The musicians settled in St. Alphege, Cripplegate, where more Jewish instrument makers joined them, this time from Poland. The Jewish musicians who were recruited were the best in Europe. They developed the violin, which was known before its use by Henry VIII's viol consort. Jewish musicians played a large part in the Renaissance of music, and some people assert that this viol consort was one of the first in the world. This is a story collected from Egypt, where many Sephardic Jews settled. I like to think that the viol consort might have encouraged the spreading of this tale. Elijah's violin. Once there was a king who was on the brink of going to war overseas. He asked his 3 daughters to name something they wanted him to bring back. His eldest asked for a star-shaped diamond so she could hold the night sky in her hands. The second daughter asked for a gown woven of pure gold so the sun would envy her as she walked. The youngest asked him to come back home safely. He laughed and hugged her. "I was planning on that," he said. "Go and think what you would like to bring me back. You have 3 days before I sail." The young princess walked out of the palace and down to her favorite thinking spot on the shore of the lake. Perched on the rock, she stared over the water. Nothing came into her mind that she did not already have. An old woman came and sat down next to her. "Why are you so sad?" the princess explained. "Ah," said the old woman, "you must ask him for Elijah's violin." Then she added in a quiet voice the princess didn't quite hear, "It is time for the melodies to be heard." The princess thanked her and ran back to her father, who was pleased she had found something she wanted. Amid hugs, kisses, and tears of farewell, the king sailed off to war. Many hard battles later, he was victorious. He set about finding the gifts for his daughters. Before too long, he had the star-shaped diamond and the gown of gold. What he didn't have and couldn't find was Elijah's violin. He sent out messengers who came back empty-handed. He consulted his wise men, who consulted their great tomes to no avail. He sought the seers, who saw nothing in the stars. He set sail, determined to search until he found Elijah's violin, and every place they landed, he looked for it. Then one day he climbed into a cave where an old man lived. "Yes," said the old man, "Elijah's violin is in the possession of the king of this land. His daughter has been enchanted, imprisoned in stone, and there is a great reward for anyone who can cure her. Take these 3 strands from the bow of the violin, and when you are in the presence of the princess, burn them immediately, then ask for the violin." "Thank you," said the king as he tucked the 3 strands away carefully in his pocket. "What can I give you in return?" "Nothing. When your daughter plays Elijah's violin, she will release all the imprisoned melodies into the world. That will be my reward." "What is your name?" asked the king. The old man smiled. "Elijah." The king and his men traveled quickly to the palace of the king. Outside the walls, the king made camp and said he was going in alone. He was admitted once. He said he wanted to cure the princess. He was warned failure might be his death. He gritted his teeth and agreed. Inside, the room where the princess stood, a fire burned in the fireplace, but no warmth came into the room. The king shivered. The princess looked for all the world as if she were made of stone. She couldn't move, but astonishingly, she could speak. When she spoke, life flowed back into her cheeks. When she stopped, she turned to stone. How did this happen? Asked the king. The princess told of her finding an unknown staircase in the palace one day and following it to the top. Up in the room, she found a mirror with a golden frame. As she looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection crept out of the mirror and forced her to change places. Ever since then, she had been petrified, turned to stone apart from when she spoke. Reports had come in of her being seen around the country, but her reflection had slipped away before anyone had managed to get a hold of her. The king remembered what he had to do. He took out the 3 strands and threw them on the fire. They burned so brightly that the air in the room warmed immediately. As he watched, life returned to the princess. Flesh and blood took the place of the stone. Your reflection is back in the mirror, said the king. Blindfold yourself before you enter the room so she doesn't have the chance to do this again. Smash the mirror with a stone. Do it now. The princess thanked the king and dashed off to complete the disenchantment. Her father was overjoyed and asked the king to name his reward. Elijah's violin, please, asked the king. The violin was handed over with great ceremony. The king left with his men and sailed back to his own country. They arrived a week later to cheers and tears of relief all around. His 3 daughters crowded around him. He gave them their gifts. The 2 elder ran off with the star-shaped diamond and the gown of woven pure gold. His youngest kissed him and hugged him. She was so glad he had come back safe and sound. Only then did she go to her room with Elijah's violin. She opened the case to find a beautifully carved violin nestling inside its plush interior. She lifted it out and took up the bow. As soon as she began to play, a wonderful melody started. It was as if the violin was playing itself. Melody after melody streamed out of the violin, out of its eternal sources. Suddenly, as the princess continued to play, a handsome young man appeared. How did you get here? Asked the princess. Through the window, he answered. Where are you from? Far, far away. The music brought me here. I had no choice. Soon the princess and the prince, for that's what he was, found that they had other things to talk about. Whenever the princess got lonely and missed the prince, she would play the violin and he would appear through the window. They fell in love and exchanged rings, promising to marry. One day, the eldest sister was passing the room when she heard her sister talking to someone. Our sister has a man in her room, I'm sure of it. You distract her, and then I can search her room for evidence, she said to her middle sister. While the 2 young sisters were having a mud massage, the eldest ransacked the princess's room. She found the prince's ring and jealously threw it through the window, breaking the glass. She opened the case and picked up Elijah's violin. The music she played was dark and full of menace. The prince was drawn by the music to the room, but as he tried to get through the window, the broken glass cut him and he disappeared. The princess shoved the violin back in its case. Hurriedly, she tidied up and left, frustrated. Fresh and relaxed from her massage, the princess returned to her room. It felt wrong, something spoiled. She wanted to speak to the prince, and so she played the violin. But he didn't come. She tried again, nothing. She walked over to the window and saw the broken glass by the curtain, 3 drops of blood. She realized the prince must be hurt, or worse. Heartbroken, the princess went down to her thinking spot, the rock by the lake. Not long after, the old woman hobbled up. The princess poured all her woes and worries into the old woman's ear. Listen, do you want to find him? The princess nodded. Then this is what you must do. Go to your room and have a doctor insist you are too ill to see anyone. Slip out of your room and then begin your search. It might take a long time. I don't care, said the princess. I have to find him and make him well again. Good, said the old woman. Take 3 strands from the bow of Elijah's violin with you. When you see him, burn the strands in the fire immediately. The princess did as she was told. The doctor came and put her under quarantine. She slipped out after taking 3 strands from the bow of Elijah's violin. She walked and walked. She walked through meadows. She walked through woods. She crossed streams. She was so tired she sat down to rest under an elder tree. As she closed her eyes, about to fall asleep, she heard two doves talking in the branches above her. She opened her eyes and the birds were cooing as usual. She closed her eyes and she understood what they were saying. Did you hear about the prince? He's been so badly injured. They think he might die, said one. Yes, it is a shame. It is so difficult to get into his palace. More people would try to cure him if they could only find the way, said the other. If only they knew the leaves of this tree are maps to his home, cooed the first. The princess shot up and broke off a green leaf. As she stared at it, a map became clear to her. She took new heart and set off with determination. After some time, she arrived at the gates of the palace. Disguised as a doctor, she knocked for admittance. I've come to cure the prince, she said, and was shown into the throne room where the king and queen sat. You do know 39 doctors have tried before you. Each one paid the price for failure. Are you willing to give up your life? Asked the king. If I can see his royal highness alone, answered the princess bravely. The king agreed, and the princess was shown into the prince's bedroom. He looked so pale and wan lying there, she wanted to rush over and kiss him. But she knew she had something to do first. She took out the 3 strands and threw them on the fire. As she watched, his cuts began to heal themselves. Blood rushed to his cheeks and flushed his body. Soon he was awake and looking into her eyes, brimming with tears of gladness. They talked and found they still felt the same way as they had before. She changed out of her doctor's disguise back into her own clothes and called his parents in. They rushed in, overjoyed at having their son back. They thanked the princess and gladly agreed to the wedding. The pair lived happily and virtuously for all their lives. The melodies from Elijah's violin often floated out into the world from their palace. Franz?
Und ich lese aus dem Buch Einfache Wahrheiten für eine schwierige Welt, die Lebensweisheiten von Jakob dem Bäcker, von Noah Ben Shea. Die erste Geschichte heißt, Wut lässt sich nicht mit Wut abwehren. Ein Mann im mittleren Alter fuchtelte mit einer Botschaft von Jakob herum, die er in einem Brotlaib gefunden hatte. Sein Gesicht war ganz verzerrt. Was willst du damit sagen? Fragte er und las vor, die Faust lässt die Hand verhungern. Jakob nahm die Wut des Mannes mit ihrer ganzen Gewalt in sich auf, verwandelte sie und legte Frieden in seine Stimme und sein Gebaren. Wenn unsere Hand zur Faust geballt ist, können wir die Gaben des Lebens nicht ergreifen. Ganz gleich, ob sie von uns selbst oder von unseren Freunden oder von Gott selbst kommen. Wenn unsere Hand zur Faust geballt ist, können wir nichts festhalten, außer unserer Bitterkeit. Wenn wir das tun, hungern wir unsere Mägen und unsere Seelen aus. Unsere Wut bringt uns eine Hungersnot. Der Mann schwieg. Die Leute ringsum flüsterten sich zu, was der Mann gesagt und was Jakob geantwortet hatte. Sie drängten den Mann weiterzugehen, aber Jakob war noch nicht fertig. Lass ab von deinem Zorn, sagte Jakob mit fliehendem Blick. Wut schließt einen Menschen in seinem eigenen Hause ein. Die nächste Geschichte heißt Angst errichten. Ein Gemeindevorsteher kam zu Jakob in der Hoffnung, Seelenfrieden zu finden, Erleichterung von seiner Last. Den Mann plagte ein wiederkehrender Traum, den er nicht verstand. Jakob, im Traum habe ich einen weiten Weg zurückgelegt und komme endlich zu einer großen Stadt. Aber am Stadttor tritt mir ein großer Soldat entgegen, der sagt, ich muss 2 Fragen beantworten, bevor ich hinein darf. Wirst du mir helfen? Jakob nickte. Die erste Frage des Soldaten lautet, was befestigt die Mauern einer Stadt? Das ist leicht, sagte Jakob. Angst befestigt die Mauern einer Stadt. Aber was befestigt die Angst? Fragte der Mann. Denn so lautete die zweite Frage. Die Mauern, antwortete Jakob. Die Ängste, die wir nicht überwinden können, werden unsere Mauern. Die nächste Geschichte ist: Demut ist der Inbegriff der Weisheit. Als die Leute nach Hause gingen, löschte Jakob die Lichter in der Backstube und zog die Tür hinter sich zu. Der morgendliche Regen war dichtem Nebel gewichen. Zum ersten Mal seit dem Aufwachen war Jakob allein. Er unterließ es absichtlich, das Mehl abzubürsten, das seine Hose befleckte. Es erinnerte ihn daran, dass er Bäcker war. Er überquerte eine schmale Brücke und lenkte seine Schritte zum Haus eines älteren Mannes, der krank war. Jakob klopfte an die Tür. Der Geruch nach Medizin und Alter hing in der Luft. Er bekam keine Antwort. Er ging hinein. Herrn Golds Spazierstock hing innen am Türknauf. Als Jakob eintrat, fing der Stock zu schwingen an, wie ein Metronom, das einer uralten Uhr die Zeit vorgibt. Herr Gold saß gegen mehrere Kissen gelehnt. Indem er seinen Zeigefinger mit der Zunge benetzte, blätterte er die Seiten seiner Bibel um. »Ach, Jakob«, sagte Herr Gold. Seine Stimme hatte den Ton eines Mannes, der sich etwas Bequemes überzieht. »Kommst du mich besuchen, weil ich krank bin und du es für deine Pflicht hältst?« »Nein, Herr Gold«, sagte Jakob. »Ihre Krankheit besuche ich aus Pflichtbewusstsein. Sie besuche ich aus Liebe.« Herr Gold lachte, belebt durch die Wärme in Jakobs Humor. »Jakob, ich höre viele Leute entdecken, wie klug du bist. Hast du für all die Menschen eine Antwort?« »Ich halte ihnen hoffnungsvoll einen Spiegel vor. Sei nicht so bescheiden. Ich wünschte, ich besäße deine Weisheit.« »Nein, das wünschen Sie nicht«, sagte Jakob nachdrücklich. Herr Gold beugte sich vor. »Woher weißt du, was ich mir wünsche?« »Woher wissen Sie, was ich weiß?«, sagte Jakob lächelnd. Die nächste Geschichte heißt: Jeder von uns ist die Quelle von des anderen Fluss. Es war einmal ein Mann, der war mit einer sehr klugen Frau verheiratet. Mit der Zeit wurde der Mann neidisch auf die Klugheit seiner Frau. Im Innersten unsicher und nach außen hin zornig redete der Mann sich ein, da der Mann vor der Frau erschaffen wurde, sei doch der Mann eindeutig überlegen. Auf der Suche nach Hilfe in seiner Unsicherheit kam er zu Jakob in die Bäckerei. Die Frau wurde aus der Rippe des Mannes erschaffen, begann der Ehemann, um die Sache von vornherein in eine für ihn günstige Position zu bringen. Ja, sagte Jakob fast ohne aufzusehen, die Frau wurde aus der Rippe eines Mannes erschaffen. Aber woraus wurde der Mann erschaffen? Aus dem Boden der Erde natürlich. Und, sagte Jakob, heißt es nicht, die Frau sei die Erde, die deinen Samen empfängt? Ja, sagte der Mann, der sich töricht vorkam. Jakob hielt in seinem Tun inne und sprach im leichten Ton der Wahrheit: Jeder von uns ist die Quelle des anderen. Und unsere einzige Stärke ist dieses Wissen. Giuliana? Oder soll ich weiter?
Nein, das geht.
Du es? Ja.
Yeah. So, this story comes from Oxford. Jews had arrived in Oxfordshire as early as 1080, when a man named Manasses is mentioned in the Domesday Book as living in the village of Bletchington. The Jews from Rouen were literate and numerate, and although banned from the guilds, were the bankers and moneylenders to the barons and the crown, paying a high tax for the privilege. By 1141, the Jews of Oxford were being oppressed by both King Stephen and Queen Matilda in their civil war. Both needed money at the same time for their separate armies, and when the Jews couldn't pay, the crown had Aaron ben Isaac's house burned to the ground. Most of the Jews lived south of Carfax in St. Aldgate, which became known as Great Jewry Street. A synagogue was built and a mikveh, the remnants of which can be seen today. Ironically, the first college to be founded in Oxford, Merton College, was originally Jacob of London's property, Beck's Hall. As an old, infirm man, he sold the property to Bishop Walter de Merton in 1264. The contract is in Latin and Hebrew and is the oldest collegiate document to survive. It is ironic because Jews were barred from attending the university until 1856 and holding a fellowship until 1871. Nowadays, Oxford is one of the most vibrant Jewish communities, with all sides of Judaism living and worshiping, if not together, then in the same building, and sharing Kiddush afterwards. How can this be? A couple went to a rabbi to mediate their upcoming divorce. The rabbi listened to the man and said, "You're right." He then listened to the woman and said, "You're right." His student, who had been following the arguments on both sides, said to him, "Rabbi, they can't both be right." The rabbi turned to him and also said, "You are also right." Rabbi Berachai, the punctuator, the Jewish Aesop, lived in Oxford in the late 12th century. His book, Mishle Shualim, Fox Fables, is a Hebrew version of Aesop's fables with a Jewish twist, as well as his own created fables. He frequently changed the animal or setting or added in a biblical reference. He often wrote in rhymed prose with a firm moral at the end. Here is one of his tales. Ewe, Goat, and Shepherd. A ewe ready to drop her lamb was in the farmyard. Outside the farmyard, in a field by a hedge, was a nanny goat. The shepherd watched and waited for the ewe to give birth. He was worried she would reject her young. When he saw she had delivered and indeed had rejected her lamb, he took it from her and brought it to the goat. The nanny goat suckled the lamb, who grew big. She looked after it and cared for it as if it was hers. When the lamb was weaned, the goat said, "Look to your ways, return to your birthplace, and do great deeds. Your mother was a ewe, your father a ram. I may have brought you up and looked after you and cared for you, but your parents will be happy to see you as you are now. Return to your people." The sheep answered, "No, you are my mother, for you have loved me and looked after me. I won't call the ewe my mother because she pushed me away far from her home and would see me no more. I have no desire to see her." Give ear and listen. Give ear to the parable and listen. He who treats you well and cares for you, count him as a relation. On the other hand, he who doesn't want to know you, even though you are related, count him nothing in a crowd. That kind of person you don't want to be bothered with. He troubles his kin and is cruel. He stores up trouble for himself if he says, "None may love me except he be related to me, for that gives me honor among the dwellers of the world." 'Tis a brother who is born for a time of trouble. I have just a very brief little tidbit that she also wrote, a little Jewish mother story. A mother brought her son 2 new ties, one blue, one green. The son wanted to wear one to his interview in Oxford the next day. He couldn't decide which to wear and asked his mother. "Choose the one that matches your suit best," replied his mother. He came down dressed with the blue tie. His mother took one look at him. "You didn't like the green one?" Franz?
Der Tod ist auch eine Türe. 2 Kinder, die auf Jakob angewiesen waren, sorgten sich, was sie tun würden, wenn er älter würde und eines Tages stürbe. Jakob, der das spürte, zog die Kinder zu sich heran und erzählte ihnen diese Geschichte. Es war einmal ein Schüler, der war viele Jahre mit einem Lehrer zusammen. Und als der Lehrer fühlte, dass er bald sterben würde, wollte er noch aus seinem Tod eine Lektion machen. Am Abend nahm der Lehrer eine Fackel, rief seinen Schüler und ging mit ihm durch den Wald. Bald gelangten sie in die Mitte des Waldes, wo der Lehrer ohne Erklärung die Fackel löschte. Was ist? Fragte der Schüler. Die Fackel ist ausgegangen, antwortete der Lehrer und ging weiter. Aber, rief der Schüler und seine Stimme verriet seine Angst, willst du mich hier im Dunkeln alleine lassen? Nein, ich will dich nicht im Dunkeln lassen, erwiderte die Stimme des Lehrers aus der Schwärze ringsum. Ich will dich das Licht suchen lassen. Es wird schon Licht. Ein Nachbar von Jakob musste eine Reise antreten, aber es war mitten in der Nacht. Furchtsam aufzubrechen, furchtsam nicht aufzubrechen, kam er zu Jakob. Es gibt kein Licht auf dem Weg, klagte er. Nimm jemanden mit, riet Jakob. Jakob, wie soll das helfen? Wir wären doch nichts weiter als 2 Blinde unterwegs. Du irrst dich, sagte Jakob. Wenn 2 Menschen erst ihre beider Blindheit entdecken, wird es schon Licht. Die nächste Geschichte heißt, eine Ewigkeit ist jeder Augenblick, der mit Geduld beginnt. Eine Mutter und ein Vater kamen zu Jakob und baten ihn, mit ihnen über die Geduld zu sprechen. Sag uns, was wir wissen müssen, um geduldiger zu sein. Geht fort, sagte Jakob, ich habe keine Zeit für euch. Nanu, sagte das Ehepaar, was denkst du, wie uns dabei zumute ist? Seht ihr, sagte Jakob lächelnd, das ist die erste Lektion in Geduld mit anderen. Giuliana.
So the next story is from Belfast in Ireland. And just a little blurb before it begins. Takes place during the time of the Troubles, in which Protestants and Catholic Irishmen were fighting each other. A Jew is walking down the street and is stopped by a patrol. And they say, "What religion are you?" And he says, "I'm a Jew." And they say, "Well, are you a Jewish Protestant or a Jewish Catholic?" So this story now takes place in Belfast. The earliest reference to the Jews in Ireland was in the year 1079. The annals of Innisfallen record 5 Jews came oversea with gifts to Tardlebach, king of Munster, and they were sent back again oversea. They were probably merchants from Normandy, where there was a secure Jewish community. Although there is a record of a Jewish tailor in Belfast in 1652, a Manuel Lightfoot, the Belfast community wasn't established properly until the 1850s. In 1845, Daniel Jaffe, a linen merchant from Hamburg, landed in Belfast to establish business contacts. Within a decade, he had his businesses up and running there. He'd moved his large family from Germany to Belfast and founded the first synagogue in Great Victoria Street. More Jewish families from Germany joined him. Due to the blockade of American ports during that country's civil war, Belfast became the center of international linen trade, and Daniel Jaffe was the heart of the town's growth. After he died, a fountain was erected in the center of Belfast in his memory. His son Otto became the first Jewish Lord Mayor of Belfast. This version is of a story found in the Mishnah and is from Germany. Stargirl. 2 angels were arguing in front of the throne of the Source. What was the subject of these angels' argument? Why, man, of course. Azazel said no son of Adam could be trusted to keep faith with God. Shemhazai disagreed. They are faithful, unlike some angels I can name. He gave Azazel a dirty look. Azazel puffed out his wings in anger. He brushed against the throne, and the decorations around it shuddered. Shemhazai puffed out his wings in response, knocking the throne the other way. One of the jewels came loose and rolled onto the floor. Both angels lunged to catch it, but it slipped out of their grasp and fell through the heavens. Azazel and Shemhazai looked at each other. They knew they were in trouble. Far below, on earth, Istahar stared up at the night sky. She loved the stars that twinkled in the velvet blackness. How she longed to be up there with them, sparkling in the night. Suddenly, she saw a flash across the sky. It was a falling star. Usually, she closed her eyes as soon as she saw one and made a wish. Somehow, she knew not to close her eyes this time. She watched the star come closer and closer. It was falling into the orchard below the field she was in. Istahar ran across the wet grass until she came to the apple trees. There, she searched for the glow of the star among the tangled branches. There, she saw it. Quickly, she grabbed hold of the gnarled trunk and hoisted herself up. She stretched and managed to just reach the star with her fingertips. Back on the ground, she wiped the star clean of debris. Now she could see it was faceted like a jewel. She'd expected points. As she turned it over, a ball of light appeared in front of her. A mellifluous voice spoke from its depths. Be careful, child. What you hold is precious. Many will want to take it from you. Do not be deceived. Guard it well, and your deepest desire will be granted. Istahar realized the ball of light was a manifestation of the Shekinah, God's presence. She bowed, and as she did so, the light disappeared. She left the orchard with the star jewel hidden in her pocket. Azazel and Shemhazai descended to earth. They folded their wings so they were flat across their backs. They looked around with pleasure. The scenery was green, the girls were pretty, the water looked inviting. This was going to be easy. The rule about not getting involved, well, all we have to do is take the jewel and get it back to the source. Yes, I know, you don't have to keep on. I'm going to bring it back. No, I am. They continued to quarrel until they reached Istahar's home. The pull of the jewel was strong. Let's toss to see who gets to try it first, said Shemhazai, and was downcast when Azazel won. Azazel, who had spent the morning with the pretty girls, was not at the top of his game when he approached Istahar. He told her how important it was to return the jewel to the throne of the Creator. He told her how dangerous it was for her to keep it. He told her that it would be best for everyone if she gave it to him. He would look after it for her. Istahar looked at Azazel. He was the epitome of cool, with his dark, good looks. He stood in the sunshine and smiled the smile that all the pretty girls were swooning over. Istahar was made of sterner stuff. She remembered what the Shekinah had said and looked closer. Azazel had no shadow. She didn't trust anyone who had no shadow, even if they were an angel. She only had his word for that. She turned from him and walked away. Azazel ground his teeth. Shemhazai smiled as he stepped forward to take his turn. Shemhazai talked to Ishtar about being an angel. He opened his wings for her. He sang songs the angels sang only for the source. Let me try your wings on and I'll give you the star jewel, said Istahar. Shemhazai looked shocked. I've shared with you more than I should have. I can't do that, he replied. Istahar allowed Shemhazai a peek at the jewel. Shemhazai gulped. I've never done this before. he said as he removed his wings from his back and fitted them to Istahar. Her face glowed as she opened the wings. She thrust up and flew straight to God. She handed the jewel over. God granted her her deepest wish and turned her into a star, where she is now twinkling down on you and me. As for Semhazai and Azazel, what happened to them is another story. What?
Ich habe meine letzten zwei Geschichten jetzt. Sich selbst verlieren. Hinter der Bäckerei lehnte ein junger Mann an der Laderampe, während er mit Jakob sprach, biss er sich nervös auf die Unterlippe. Es tut mir leid, wenn ich deine Zeit beanspruche, aber ich heirate bald und der angehende Bräutigam hielt stammelnd inne. Jakob nickte, sagte aber nichts. Der junge Mann begann abermals seine Befürchtungen zu offenbaren. Ich heirate bald, aber ich fürchte, wenn ich mich mit einer Frau zusammentue, verliere ich einen Teil von mir selbst. Jakob machte eine Handbewegung, als ob er die Ängste fortwischen wollte. Mach dir darüber keine Gedanken. Wenn du dich mit einer Frau vereinst, wirst du keinen Teil von dir verlieren. Vielmehr, Jakob klopfte dem jungen Mann auf die Schultern, besteht eine gute Chance, dass du dich nicht länger in dir selbst verlierst, wenn du dich mit einer Frau vereinst. Verstehen ist nicht Weisheit, sondern wie Weisheit erschlossen wird. Das ist die letzte Geschichte. Ein reicher Mann kam zu Jakob und suchte seinen Rat. Warum muss ich den Armen etwas geben? Jakob antwortete, weil du ihnen deine Freiheit verdankst. Der Mann war verblüfft. Wieso macht es mich frei, wenn ich den Armen gebe? Weißt du, sagte Jakob, entweder liegt der Schlüssel zur Brieftasche eines Mannes in seinem Herzen oder der Schlüssel zu seinem Herzen liegt in seiner Brieftasche. Daran bist du, wenn du dich nicht wohltätig erweist, in deiner Habgier gefangen.
So, ich habe eine letzte kurze. This story comes from Liverpool, where many Jews actually settled after initially coming there, thinking that they were going to be leaving from there to go to the Americas. And it has a pretty large, vibrant Jewish community. The story is called Flying Feathers. There was a problem for the Liverpool community. One of its outstanding businessmen couldn't resist embroidering the problems of his rivals, all to boost his own ego. It got so that in the end, he had lucked on one poor individual who couldn't and wouldn't stand up to him in public. This opponent took all the rudeness and the exaggerated stories that the businessman threw to him, which of course made the man try to get some reaction from him. Then, as these things happen, our businessman found out something awful but true about his rival. He couldn't resist. He went to the shul in Prince's Road that morning and passed on with a nod and a wink a little bit of the truth to the other men there. Men are such dreadful gossips, aren't they? The men rushed home to tell their wives. The wives met at the fishmongers and the bakers, and one told another what they had heard. Soon a version of the truth, worse than the actuality, had spread across Liverpool. Even the liverbirds cawed about it. The center of this rumor finally heard it. This hit him in the heart, and he couldn't believe a fellow Jew would say such things. He went to the rabbi and poured out his sorrows. The rabbi listened. The next day, the rabbi stopped our businessman as he was leaving the morning prayers. He blustered, "But what's the problem, Rabbi? It's true, the story I was telling, isn't it?" "Whether it's true or not isn't the question," answered the rabbi. "What you have done is lashon hara, and you've ruined his reputation. This is like murder. The rabbi went on until the businessman not only understood what he'd done, but felt sorry for it, but really wasn't sure if he could make it any better. The rabbi looked at him. Do you have any feather pillows in your house? The businessman preened. Of course, plenty, with the best feathers, the softest grade. How many do you want? Just the one. Bring it to me this afternoon. We'll meet upstairs in the women's gallery. That afternoon, the businessman brought his whitest, softest pillow to the rabbi. They climbed the stairs to the women's gallery. The pair looked down at the shul from this unusual angle. They saw what the women saw as they sat listening and watching the service taking place so far below them. They saw the pillars rising above them to make the graceful arches, the clear rose window over the beautiful blue domes with their gold stars and Hebrew inscription that honored the Aron HaKodesh, the holy ark that contained the Sifrei Torah. They looked down on the bima, where the Chazan stood to lead the prayers, the pews with their wooden arms and leather box seats, all on either side under the women's gallery. The shul was gorgeous, ornate, intricate. The rabbi looked the pillow over and nodded. He handed the businessman a knife. Cut it. What? Cut it, repeated the rabbi. Mystified, the businessman cut the pillow open. Now, shake out all the feathers. Well, if that's what you want. The businessman took the pillow and shook it out with all his strength. The feathers flew out and gusted around the shul. They swirled up to the ceiling and floated down among the lights, trapped in the chains before drifting off to fall here and there and everywhere. A slight draft from the door upstairs and downstairs caught some and hustled them out into the busy world of Prince's Road. The rabbi looked at the blanket of feathers. The businessman looked at the blanket of feathers. A few minutes later, as feathers fell off the Ner Tamid to the floor, the rabbi spoke again. Now, collect them all up and bring them back. All, mind, every single one of them. But that's impossible, Rabbi. I'll never get them all. Some will have gone down the cracks in the seats, others behind the domes, and I know some went out onto the street. Yes, nodded the rabbi. That's how it's done with a rumor. One of your stories, a little gossip here and there. You don't know where it goes, and you can never call it back. The businessman realized what he had done. The rabbi made him apologize and compensate the man he had wronged. He had to apologize to all the people he'd shared the story with, too. He never exaggerated again, nor told stories about other people. And the whole congregation were reminded to watch what they said as well on the occasional Shabbos, when they saw a feather floating above their heads, coming from, it seemed, the heavens.